Hello, everyone. Welcome to the series Mudd Talks, Making a Makerspace with Professor Jeff Groves. My name is Vanessa Chu, Assistant Director in the Office of Alumni and Parent Relations. We thank you for attending, and we hope you and your family are safe and healthy during this time. This talk is being recorded and will be distributed along with any presentation materials after the event. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we will try to get through as many questions as we can after the presentation. Now, to briefly introduce our speaker, Jeff Groves, Louisa and Robert Miller Professor of Humanities, joined the faculty in 1988, and he has held numerous leadership positions, including serving as Dean of the Faculty and Vice President for Academic Affairs from 2012 to 2017. He has taught a wide variety of courses during his time at the college, several of them featuring making as a central component. He is now the inaugural director of the Makerspace. I now turn it over to you, Jeff. Take it away.
Thanks, Vanessa, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. It's great to know that you're out there in webinar land tonight. Harvey Mudd's new Makerspace is an exciting addition to the college and to the consortium, and I am honored to be part of bringing this space into being. The McGregor Computer Science Center, in which the Makerspace will be housed, will open later this spring. It will complete construction in mid-February. And the Makerspace itself will open for business fully in late August of 2021. I'm really looking forward to that date. This evening, I'm going to give you some background on building a makerspace at Mudd. I'm going to provide you with some context about the maker movement and other higher education makerspaces. And then I'm going to talk you through our current planning with the help of some very recent photographs of the makerspace itself. So that will be fun. I received some questions from a few of you prior to the webinar, and I'll try to address most of those as I move through the talk. But if I've missed something or if there are other questions that come up, of course, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Okay. Now, the first thing to be said, of course, is that I'm not doing this alone. To adopt a saying that had a lot of currency a few years ago, it takes a college to raise a makerspace. I'd like to call out some people who have been very important in the creation of this makerspace so far, and do that right here at the top of the presentation. First of all, President Maria Clave, Dean of the Faculty Lisa Sullivan, and the trustees of the HMC Board of Trustees have been supportive and encouraging of this project for a number of years now. Vice President for Advancement, Hugh Wynn, Assistant Vice President, Jessica Berger, and the entire advancement staff are working hard to put the Makerspace on a solid financial foundation. The faculty, staff, and student members of the Makerspace Advisory Committee are deeply engaged in planning for our late summer opening. And the students who have been involved with our temporary makerspace established in 2015, and here I'd especially like to call out the current leaders of the makerspace, seniors Jacob Donenfeld and Eric Mike, have provided us with some inspiring models about how the new space can be structured and programmed. Finally, Drew Price, our amazing machine shop manager, who is also now serving as interim makerspace manager, is a dynamic and enthusiastic partner in planning for the makerspace. Together, all of us are working with many other people to make this makerspace a reality. But all of that begs the question, why? Why build a makerspace at Mudd? The most obvious answer to that question is that the HMC student body has always included a large and multifaceted maker culture. From rocketry to sewing clubs, from art projects to robotics, from building furniture for dorm rooms to machining hammers for E4. HMC students have always displayed a strong desire for and strong interest in making. I sometimes wonder whether our deeply ingrained culture of pranks isn't part of this desire. After all, there's a strong hands-on component to taking apart a VW Bug and reassembling it in a residence hall, or to concocting a complex and ultimately successful plan to steal the Caltech cannon. In fact, maybe the real question isn't why build a makerspace, but why haven't we gotten around to doing that already? Over the last 2 decades, hundreds of other higher education institutions have built makerspaces, and in some senses, we are a little late in coming to the game. That lateness, however, provides us with the advantage of learning from what these other institutions have done, of viewing their successes and building on those successes. And you'll see as I move through the talk that we are indeed doing that. But in addition to addressing the maker culture at the college and to tapping into a dynamic trend in higher education, the most compelling reason for building a makerspace, in my mind, is that doing so aligns with our educational priorities and with our strategic goals. A facility in which students build community around shared hands-on work will help our students to appreciate and employ different kinds of knowledge. Importantly, they will be at the center of transferring this knowledge to each other, and that's a point that I'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation. Given the hands-on work of a makerspace, it will support our college emphasis on experiential and interdisciplinary learning. Because much of the work undertaken in the makerspace will be personal projects, allowing students to explore their passions, the facility will nurture and develop the whole person. And the makerspace will address our commitment to improving infrastructure and resources for our community. So in all of those ways, the makerspace really addresses what we want to do with our education at Harvey Mudd. Now, some of the developing literature about makerspaces suggests that alignment with the college's sense of mission is crucial. And in that respect, I believe we're on the right track. Regarding one of the points I raised just a moment ago, nurturing the whole person, I'll add that several studies have argued that many students who work in makerspaces feel more confident in their academic abilities because they work in makerspaces, because they participate in a makerspace community. And I suspect that this increased confidence has to do with what our late colleague, Professor Richard Olson, used to refer to as the principle of perceived control. Dick used that phrase in a compelling way to argue that if students felt overwhelmed by a curriculum, providing them with ways of feeling some modicum of control in their lives would build their confidence and help them to succeed academically. And for many of our students, the makerspace, where students will be able to develop projects of their own design, bring them to completion with their own hands, their own brains, share their accomplishments with other makers who participate in this same space, that is, I think, going to be a real confidence builder, a real control builder for many of our students. Now, there may be a kind of obvious question that many of you are thinking about this evening, and that is this. What is a professor of literature doing as the inaugural director of the Harvey Mudd College Makerspace? Well, given that many higher education makerspaces have been associated with engineering or design programs, this is actually a reasonable question to ask. But I'll add that I do have some street cred in this respect. There are lots of makers in my family, including my father, a talented woodworker who's here in the audience this evening. Hi, Dad. And many of the courses I've taught at HMC over many decades have had a making component built into them. In the Shakespeare course that I taught for 22 years, students every spring made a play. Since 2008, I've been teaching a letterpress printing course in a studio that I built down at the Claremont College's library. And in 2011-12, during a sabbatical, I built a working wooden common press a one-to-one scale replica of an original built in 1747. So I am a maker myself, but there are other reasons why it makes sense to have a non-engineer take on this role initially. While 15 years ago, many makerspaces were closely tied to engineering or design programs, in the last decade, that has been less and less the case. Makerspaces are moving away from narrow disciplinary models, and the dominant trend in newer makerspaces is to build them to be accessible to users far outside their traditional disciplinary base. For a college that describes itself as a liberal arts college of science and engineering, for a college that supports an extensive program in the humanities, social sciences, and the arts, it makes sense that our makerspace should follow this trend. Indeed, the literature on makerspaces is beginning to document and analyze the role of makerspaces for the humanities, social sciences, and the arts. Some interesting evidence from the Yale Center for Engineering, Innovation, and Design, or the CEID, in this regard. In 2016, there were 2,000 registered members of the Yale CEID. And I should note that the CEID is a 9,000 square foot makerspace that lives in the School of Engineering and Applied Science at Yale. Now, of those 2,000 members, 48% were from STEM disciplines. 31% were from the humanities and social sciences. And of the other 21% who didn't in the survey indicate what discipline they came from, surely there would have been some proportion of humanities, social sciences, and the arts students in that mix. So the Yale CEID Makerspace, which is committed to engineering education, is also committed to and strongly supports making in other disciplines. Another interesting example that suggests the movement of makerspaces away from narrowly defined disciplinary control can be found at the Georgia Tech Flowers Invention Studio, which is completely student run. It's a very interesting model that they have there. Student mentors at the Invention Studio lead workshops in such topics as microcontroller programming and motorized scooter design, and probably we wouldn't find those kinds of topics surprising in a makerspace, but they also lead workshops in stained glass window making, in bookbinding, in knitting. And so this example also suggests that increased accessibility of higher education makerspaces to students beyond the traditional user base is a key trend over the last decade. Now, I've been talking for several minutes now, and I haven't bothered to define what a makerspace is yet. So let me spend a few minutes clarifying that term. Vincent Wilczynski is the Deputy Dean of the Yale School of Engineering and Applied Science and the James S. Tyler Director of the CEID. And in addition to that, he has become, over the last decade, a leading scholar on makerspaces. In a 2017 article, he points out that, quote, the range of academic makerspaces extends from portable carts to entire buildings, with the number of participants scaling with the size of the facility, end quote. We can see that variety of size in the three images on this particular slide: a maker cart, a very small makerspace, and a building size makerspace. In terms of scale, our makerspace, the Harvey Mudd Makerspace, will not take up an entire building, but it will be on the large side comparatively. According to another article co-authored by Wilczynski, most makerspaces range between 1,000 and 5,000 square feet. Our makerspace will have approximately 8,500 square feet in the McGregor Computer Science Center, in which students can exercise their creativity. Now, here are two prose definitions of what constitutes a makerspace. In the first one, the one on top, the authors, Hira and Hines, succinctly and clearly define makerspaces as, quote, environments where individuals use technologies to make physical artifacts within a community of fellow users. And I really like the clarity of that definition, but I would perhaps add a few notes to it. First, these environments are curated either by faculty, staff, or students who make decisions about equipment, programming, safety, and so on to match the needs and desires of the local makerspace community. Second, the technologies of contemporary makerspaces range from the simple to the complex, from analog to digital. And sometimes these technologies get shuffled in interesting ways. For instance, I had a student in my printing workshop who used a computer to create an image. Then he used a laser cutter to cut that image into a block of wood. And he used that block of wood to print on a piece of paper using a 19th century cast iron hand press. Third, not every artifact created in a makerspace needs to be physical, which is why we've incorporated an audio-visual studio in our makerspace that will allow the production of digital video, audio, special effects, and so on. Fourth, community more and more often indicates some sort of collective governance of the makerspace. So one study reports that 70% of the makerspaces in the study sample use a hybrid management system that relies on a small number of staff members and a large number of trained student workers. And as Wilczynski and Adrezin argue, that community, that sense of community, is key to distinguishing makerspaces from other facilities where people build things, such as labs, shops, or studios. Now, some proponents of makerspaces, people like Dale Doherty and Mark Hatch, who've written extensively on makerspaces, hold that making is a central part of being human. And for me, it's kind of hard to dispute that. That seems like a fairly obvious statement. But at the same time, being a makerspace, being a maker in a makerspace is in some ways different than being, say, a hobbyist in a garage. The key to the difference is the community that gets built around a particular space. As noted earlier, makerspaces stand apart from traditional labs, shops, and studios in that the creation of community is a central goal, and even in terms of managing the makerspace, a kind of structural necessity. Of course, communities can vary in their emphases. Hira and Hines distinguish between three kinds of makerspaces. First, there are fab labs or fabrication laboratories, which are typically entrepreneurial in character. Technologies in fab labs support prototyping and invention with the notion that products will find their way into the market. Second, hacker spaces are community operating tinkering spaces where people can learn from each other. So they're kind of like makerspaces in that respect, but they tend not to create alliances that are as lasting as those in makerspaces. And third, makerspaces, and especially academic makerspaces as opposed to some commercial makerspaces, are more deliberate about creating community through easy access to technologies. And they generally place more emphasis on organized education and learning as the fabric of those communities than do hackerspaces. Now, different opinions abound about how to date the higher education makerspace movement. Wilczynski and Adrezin trace the history of makerspaces to European open source and hacking organizations that developed in the late 20th century. Seems like such a long time ago now, right? Other scholars, like those quoted in this slide, date the origin of makerspaces to the first decade of the 21st century. And certainly by the second decade of the 21st century, a huge number of higher education makerspaces were being founded all over the world. Megan Tomko and her colleagues estimate that the number of makerspaces between 2008 and 2018 increased 14-fold. That's a heck of an increase. In that same decade, the Higher Education Makerspace Initiative was founded, and HEMI, as it is known, began instituting annual conferences, the International Symposium on Academic Makerspaces, in 2016. Hemi also founded a journal in 2017, the International Journal of Academic Makerspaces and Making, IJAM, and other journals in engineering and education have become provinces for publications about makerspaces. So in addition to such attempts to bring academic makers together through typically academic ways, like publishing articles and holding conferences and so on, the spread of higher education makerspaces over the last 2 decades was also helped by 2 key technological developments. First, certain technologies, such as 3D printers, became available in dramatically lower cost versions that allowed those technologies to proliferate in academic labs and studios. And the rapid proliferation of this equipment, of these tools, allowed for the creation of complex products or parts without having to master machining skills. And so they lowered the barriers of access, especially for computer literate young people, and allowed makers to create ever more sophisticated artifacts. Second, in 2005, YouTube came along, and suddenly the maker movement had a simple and really effective platform for sharing instructional and how-to videos. And such tutorials are now a mainstay of the maker movement. Conceptually, higher education makerspaces share the assumption that hands-on learning, no matter the discipline, sparks innovation, sparks critical thinking skills, and sparks self-motivation. We have some evidence to back up those assumptions, although the field is young at this point and has not been fully assessed. Another interesting commonality is that many higher education makerspaces have developed outreach programs to help diversify the maker population, which in its early days was overwhelmingly male and dominantly white. The HMC Makerspace will follow this trend and develop outreach programs that connect the facility to our own Upward Bound program, as well as working with the college's Office of Community Engagement to provide programming for other local organizations and public schools. Now, what is the brief history, which is still unfolding, of our own makerspace? Well, despite the short-lived existence of a number of hobby or club spaces on the Harvey Mudd campus since the college began decades ago, it was not really until the opening of the R. Michael Shanahan Center for Teaching and Learning in 2013 that a permanent home for our student maker culture became possible. The Shanahan building released about 24,000 square feet in the rest of the academic complex at Harvey Mudd College. And in 2012, the college began to consider how to repurpose that space. During those discussions, Professor Liz Orwin, the chair of the engineering department, became the leading faculty voice in advocating for a makerspace. In spite of her disciplinary background, Liz argued strongly and persuasively that a makerspace should not be affiliated with any one department. Rather, it should be an all-college facility dedicated to hands-on learning. I was serving as the dean of the faculty at that time and was managing the vacated space program on behalf of the president's cabinet. And I was compelled by Liz's argument to try to build the makerspace into our space planning process, which we did. We even had a plan, didn't last very long, maybe 6 months, for a while, where we considered, this will make sense to those of you who are alums, we considered turning the Galileo Auditoria into a makerspace. But in the end, we concluded that the auditoria themselves should be renovated and preserved for future use. Now, the Board of Trustees heard about the makerspace idea through reports on the vacated space program, and several trustees championed the idea of placing the makerspace in a new building, which was then designated AB1 and now is known as the McGregor Center. Since that building was still at least a few years in the future, the trustees also asked facilities and maintenance to convert an old classroom in the Jacobs Keck basement into a temporary makerspace that students could manage and utilize until the new building was completed. And you saw a slide of that space a few minutes ago. As you can see from the beginning of the conversation about a makerspace to the opening of the makerspace itself, that's almost 10 years, which may seem like a long time, but that span has given us the time to closely consider what we would like in a makerspace and to work with our building architects, the firm of Steinberg Hart, to design a really striking space. And that said, it's probably time that I showed you some images of that space. So this is the exterior from the southwest of the Scott A. McGregor Computer Science Center, which is named for the husband of one of our trustees, Laurie J. Durand. This building will function as a new and inviting doorway into the HMC campus, a doorway that faces the other Claremont colleges. The stairway that you can see leading up into the center of the building actually goes into an open air courtyard that cuts through the middle of the building. So you can enter the building through that stairway, or you can go right into the Harvey Mudd campus. And I'll come back to the way that it cuts the second floor in just a second. You can see that there are 3 floors in the building. The top floor will be the faculty offices and meeting room and department offices for the computer science department. It's going to be a really beautiful space for that important department. The second floor, as I said, is cut by that courtyard into 2 pieces. The piece that is nearest to us is actually made up of clinic spaces. So the department, the CS department, has not had enough clinic spaces and of the right kind. This will remedy that problem for them. And on the far side, the east side of the building, the second floor is a series of labs, 3 labs, 2 of which can actually be turned into one large lab that will serve the computer science curriculum. And so the computer science department, I think, is really looking forward to moving into this wonderful new facility. Now, if we go down to the ground floor, which is most relevant to our conversation today, on the corner closest to us, there are actually 2 more computer science labs, and those are robotics labs. And we're actually delighted that the robotics labs are on the same floor as the makerspace, because there is a kind of time-honored connection between robotics and makerspaces. There is also one other very small computer science lab on that floor, but beyond that, and not counting, you know, the restrooms and the elevators and stuff like that, beyond that, all of the rest of the space on that ground floor is makerspace. And here's how it's laid out. So the areas in buff or yellow constitute the makerspace, although there is one room that is miscolored on the left-hand side. The room that says AV Media should be in yellow because that's part of the makerspace. And I apologize for the confusion of color. Now, what will it be like to enter the makerspace? Well, for Harvey Mudd students, they'll probably come into it one of 2 ways. They'll come down the stairway from the computer science department, or they will come to the makerspace through the tunnel-like subterranean hallways that only Harvey Mudd students fully understand, and enter the makerspace in that way. Now, those of you who are alums are looking at this diagram and you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't look quite right, because that's not where the student machine shop and the student wood shop are actually at. They're further to the east, right? And for right now, you're right. But by late August, the student machine shop, the student wood shop will have moved to this location so that they are directly across the hallway from the makerspace. And that is really important, because we're imagining that there is going to be a huge amount of back and forth between the student shops and the makerspace. While it might be true that many students use the makerspace on its own and have no need for some of the equipment in the shops, many other students are going to need to utilize equipment on both sides of the hallway. So it's exciting to think about the way in which these facilities are contiguous. Now, if you come in from the south, you will enter into a lounge area, and I'll talk more about that lounge in a minute. And as you proceed north, you'll go through a collaboration area and then enter the fabrication area as you go. Much of this facility is going to be 24/7. it's not really lockable. You can get to it if you can get into the academic complex. So students will be able to use this makerspace at any time of the day or night, but they won't be able to use all of the tools at any time of the day or night. Some of the tools where there are safety restrictions will live in the tool checkout area and will need to be checked out during the working hours of the makerspace. But even if you came in at 3 in the morning, you would be able to enter the makerspace and find basic tools, scissors, hammers, wrenches, screwdrivers. Those kinds of things will live on the floor and students will be able to use them whenever they need them. The makerspace will not be a schedulable classroom. That is, I could not go to the registrar and say, you know, I want to reserve the makerspace on Tuesday and Thursday from 1:15 to 2:30 for my poetry course. That's not the way that we're going to use this space. That would interfere with the student use of the space, and students are our key customers, our key users. As Case Western professor Malcolm Cook and his colleagues note in a recent article, quote, "Without careful planning, a single course can take over a space, limiting its usefulness for the rest of the community," end quote. And that's something that we don't want to have happen. But even if the makerspace is not a schedulable classroom, students will still bring their coursework there, and faculty members will begin to build the resource into their thinking about their own courses and about their own assignments. And that will drive even more students to the makerspace to utilize what's there. Moreover, the staff in the makerspace, especially the manager and the faculty developer, will develop ways of interacting with the curriculum at large. And what I mean by that is you could imagine that in an art course where students were going to experiment with different kinds of art, the professor may decide that the students would benefit from learning how to weld. If that's the case, we can offer a workshop in the makerspace that will allow students to learn how to weld so that they could put together, say, a steel sculpture. Now, this is the south entrance to the building, and HMC has been noting since committing to this facility that the makerspace will be open to the students from the other Claremont colleges. So this is probably the view that they will have of it as they approach. The door into the makerspace is just to the right of the stairway. And in thinking about the consortium, the other Claremont colleges, it's important to note that one of the exciting possibilities for the new makerspace is collaborating with the Hive at Pomona College, or to give the Hive its official name, the Rick and Susan Sontag Center for Collaborative Creativity. The Hive, which is situated at Pomona, but it is also a kind of 5-college resource. The Hive is also a kind of makerspace, but it specializes in human-centered design and does not emphasize the use of the larger scale equipment that will be featured in our facility. Students all around Claremont love the Hive, and what they love most about it, I think, is the positive community that has been fostered and created there around acts of shared creation. And so our two facilities, the Makerspace and the Hive, and bringing in the shops as well, our facilities should be able to combine our somewhat different characters to offer workshops that students will value, workshops that perhaps neither of us could offer on our own. As we step into the Makerspace, the first thing we encounter is this lounge. And it's a place where students will be able to talk about making projects, talk about other topics, do homework, or just sit and take in the scene. It's meant to make the space feel easily accessible and controllable so that you don't step directly into something like a shop where you walk in the door and there are a lot of whirling blades or whirling cutter bits around you. Here we wanted to create a more relaxed, welcoming atmosphere. Peter Mylon and his colleagues at the University of Sheffield wrote several years ago that the lounge they designed into their makerspace is, quote, completely incompatible with a workshop. But for a makerspace, it is a vital space where students can hang out and relax with each other Rather than being in a classroom or in a manufacturing facility you come into, work on your own, and leave without interacting with anybody. And we're looking for the same basic reaction in our lounge. We hope then that the lounge will be an important tool in creating community within the makerspace. I've mentioned community a number of times so far. Let me say a couple more words about it now. If the best we do with our makerspace is to fill this very large complex with some interesting equipment over the next couple of years, we will have failed. The point of the makerspace is not really the equipment or the tools, and it's not really the space. The point of the makerspace is to create community, to build that community, and to build excitement in our students for the act of creation, whether they're creating for coursework or creating out of their own personal interest. So in addition to building spaces that support community, we will also follow the trend I mentioned earlier and staff the makerspace with a small army of students. Mala Arthur, HMC class of 1982, who I believe is on the webinar tonight. Mala directs the Mountie Makerspace at nearby Mount San Antonio College, and she recently described for Drew Price and myself a model for student workers that we intend to mimic. Rather than having student workers sit at a desk like a reference librarian where students have to find their way to the expert, our makerspace stewards will be more like waiters in a restaurant. Well, good waiters in a restaurant, constantly watching their customers, making contact with everyone who enters the space, making sure that they have what they need to use in that space. So we will have a faculty director and a staff manager of the makerspace. But during the academic year, we will employ something like 40 or 45 students who will serve as stewards for the facility, helping other students to access what they need to complete their course or personal work. They will be largely responsible for developing and maintaining safety protocols in the makerspace as well. This is essentially a model that we use in our student shops where it works well. We are also going to hire a small number of summer stewards each year. They will be the core leadership team of the makerspace, working directly with the director and manager on policies and safety issues, programming, instructional materials, ensuring that the space is inclusive, and so on. And their work will typically continue into the following academic year for a few hours each week, where they will help with the training of the academic year stewards. In November, Drew and I advertised the summer student positions for 2021, and we received 57 applications for the 6 positions. We interviewed 50 students. I wish we could have hired all 50 of them. They were terrific, really interesting people with great backgrounds and a lot of passion for the idea of a makerspace. But we wound up hiring 6. Those 6 are extraordinary people, and Drew and I are really looking forward to working with them starting in May. Now, it speaks to the student excitement about the makerspace that almost everyone who did not get a summer position, but who applied for one, has told us that they would like to work in the makerspace during the academic year. The enthusiasm and excitement that we heard from the students when we interviewed them makes us sure that students will be eager to make this new facility a key part of their college lives. Now, let me take you quickly through some slides that show the makerspace. On the left here, you'll see the architect's rendering of the makerspace, and on the right, the actual makerspace. In the right-hand photo, on the left, you see some glass doors that go on to an outdoor deck. I'll show that to you in a minute. In the middle of that image is a white wall. That will be our welding station. And to the right of that are the doors that lead into the hallway and across the hallway to the student shops. It's a really fantastic looking facility. On the left here, we're standing inside the tool checkout room and looking across the makerspace. That's about 60 feet so that you have a sense of scale across that distance. And then in the right-hand image, we're looking into the 3D printing, laser cutting, and water jet cutting room, which is about 20 feet by 30 feet. On the left here, we're again in the fabrication space, and now we're kind of looking out the glass doors onto the deck that you can see in the right-hand image. That deck is going to be a godsend for us, I think. First, it will allow large projects to come into the makerspace if we want to bring them into the makerspace, but it will also allow us to constrain certain kinds of activities to the outdoor space using a metal chop saw, for instance, or grinders on metal so that we don't get the particulates all over the makerspace itself. And finally, here is the audiovisual studio, again with an architect's rendering on the left and the actual studio on the right. And this is a facility that we don't have at the moment. So I think both students and faculty members are eager to get at it. Now, the equipment when we open will be much as you see here: 3D printers, a laser cutter, water jet cutters, a paint booth, welders, electronics equipment. We are considering the purchase of a computerized jacquard loom, which will allow students to make their own textiles, and all sorts of power and hand tools. And in the AV space, we'll have still and video cameras, microphones, lighting, and a cyclorama, which will allow for infinite backgrounds, basically curving all of the hard corners so that you can light the background in a special way. I want to call your attention to the quotation at the bottom: a student-led makerspace is by nature an evolving concept. And that is going to be true for our makerspace, since it will be largely student run. 5 years from now, our equipment list is no doubt going to look rather different than it looks now. Now, in terms of key tasks for me, what I would say over the next few years I need to work on the most is, first of all, working with the stewards, both the summer stewards and the academic year stewards, to build that makerspace community that I've talked so much about. I'll be working with the manager of the makerspace to build connections to the faculty. A lot of our faculty members don't really know what the makerspace might be able to do for them and their teaching at this point. And so it will be really fun to bring them into the space and help them think that through. And then perhaps the most important is working with our advancement office to raise money for the operating budget and endowment. That's something we've already started on and made good progress on, but there's still a lot of work to be done on that score. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions from the audience and look forward to chatting with you.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So we do have a question. Will the Makerspace be partnering with local professional organizations whose members are professionals in various supporting fields such as studio skills, model building, audio, sound, recording engineers, computer graphics, and animation?
That is a terrific question. And the simple answer is, I don't know. One of the things that we will be doing in terms of thinking about those kinds of partnerships is working with our stewards to determine what makes sense for our current students. I can imagine that there might be lots of really interesting connections with local professionals that would help our students with the projects that they're working on. But I'm not quite sure yet what shape those kinds of connections will take.
Great, thank you. Will alumni be able to use the space?
Yes. We've already had several alumni requests to use the space. And I think that so long as the alums are not interfering with the use of the space by current students, I think that would actually be accessible. Look, one of the most exciting things about this makerspace, I think, is the way in which it will get alums excited about this space and make them want to support it for our current students. I can imagine tons of alums looking at this space and thinking, gosh, I wish I had that when I was a student at the college. So yes, we want alums to come visit often, and if there is a way to create some ability to work, or perhaps to teach others how to work with some of the equipment that we've got, we'd be very interested in talking about that.
Awesome. What are the goals for the endowment and funding for the Makerspace, and how can alumni help out there?
The goals for the funding of the Makerspace are that we would like to get to a point where we have fully endowed the operating budget. And the operating budget, Makerspaces are not cheap, especially when we have a large student staff, as we're talking about. So the operating budget will probably be somewhere around $250,000 per year. We have some of that operating budget raised already through a generous sort of transfer of endowments, but we are looking for more donors to help with that endowment. But in the short run, I will say that that small gifts are going to help us a lot too. So if you are interested in the Makerspace, you could contact me. You could contact Hugh Wynn in advancement or Jessica Berger in advancement, and find out how you could contribute to the Makerspace. Any and all gifts will help us to sort of spread our current funding as far as we can to make the Makerspace as brilliant as we want it to be when we open.
Great, thank you. Will there be some public events at the Makerspace at this point?
Yeah, we will definitely have a public event when we open in August, and that will be an all college, all consortium event, and we'd love to have friends of the college, alums come to that as well. As you can see, it's a big space, so given that LA County allows us to gather, we could gather a lot of people in that space and really celebrate the coming of the Makerspace to Harvey Mudd College.
What type of consumables and materials do you intend to provide in the Makerspace? Will users need to buy them from a supply store in the Makerspace, or will it be provided?
Also a great question. There are certain kinds of consumables that we will probably have on stock all the time, you know, foam board and, you know, sort of small scale things like that. But we can't really anticipate all of the projects that students are going to bring to this space. Some of those projects will be funded by whatever course students are in. So you could imagine that a particular course has funding in place for the materials that students need to do the building that they're going to do for that course. But there may be especially a lot of sort of passion projects on the part of students where they'd like to use maybe, I don't know, a special wood to build something and they need to buy that wood and they don't have the funds. So we are hoping that we can create a fund. We believe that we have a little bit of this funding already in place that would allow students to make a proposal to the Makerspace stewards. And the stewards would be able to use this fund of money to support up to a certain dollar amount. Maybe it would be $50, maybe it would be $100, to support the purchase of materials for that particular project. That is one of the things that we've learned from our current Makerspace leaders. They've had real success with a program like that, and it has been very encouraging for people who might not otherwise have been able to really pull off what they wanted to do in the Makerspace because they just didn't have the funding to pay for their materials.
Great, thank you. How will you handle the potential for students that may need to use the same resources at the same time?
Well, that's something that we'll be working on with the stewards this summer. We don't have a plan for that exactly yet, but lots of other Makerspaces have solved this issue in various ways, and we will probably be looking at what they have done. It may be possible that we have a reservation system for certain very popular technologies. I think we'll have to see what the manager and I and the summer stewards come up with as what seems like a reasonable way to move forward before I can answer that question fully. But I do suspect that there will be times when there is a lot of competition for some of the tooling or equipment that we've got, and we will have to work out a way of sort of mediating that. That is clear.
Thank you. What will be the relationship between the Makerspace and clinic projects?
Sure. So we are, you know, Clinic projects mostly now have a lot of space of their own, and most students will spend most of their time working on their clinic project probably in their own clinic space. But clinic is part of our curriculum, and if students want to bring part of their clinic project into the makerspace, that will be great. There is not beyond that a sort of direct relationship between clinic and the makerspace, other than the makerspace being available for student work.
Great. What hours do you expect the space to be open?
We will probably be open something like the same hours as the student shops, which currently I think are open from noon to 10. And we'll probably mimic those hours. Now we recognize that the hours that I would use the makerspace are probably different from the hours that a lot of students would want to use the makerspace. So we do want to be sensitive to that and think about whether we can establish a way for stewards to help students with off-hour access of equipment, if that seems like a reasonable thing. That does happen at some other makerspaces, although you have to be pretty careful about safety issues in that respect, making sure that there are at least 2 people on the floor at all times and that the student using the equipment is definitely checked out on it. But we may be able to support that. We'll kind of have to see how that works. And again, that will be something that we'll be working on with the summer stewards this summer.
Thank you. How will Makerspace work with student organizations like Mudd Robotics?
I think student organizations and clubs will probably be all over the makerspace. They'll be using it regularly. We will have some storage for student projects, and for clubs and student organizations, I think that could be really useful from time to time. If there's one thing I could wish for in the makerspace, it would be more storage. You can never have too much storage, but we've got quite a bit as it goes, and I think we'll be able to dedicate a fair amount of that to student project storage. So I think that will be helpful to clubs and student organizations. Otherwise, we look forward to working with them as they move forward on whatever projects they want to bring in.
Awesome. What are your thoughts on 3D printing in the space?
3D printing, we're going to have a lot of it. We are aware that there is a lot of desire for 3D printing among our students. 3D printing is not something that I know all that much about, but my colleague Drew Price knows quite a bit about it. And we are currently looking at bringing a number of different 3D printers into the space. We will probably start with fairly accessible 3D printers, but we would be interested, you know, as we evolve the equipment in the makerspace, in moving towards some sort of higher end, more sophisticated 3D printers, perhaps printers that can print in different kinds of metals or resins, and that will allow our students to really experiment with the different possibilities of those different machines. But 3D printing is going to be a very big part of the makerspace.
Awesome, that's super exciting. In the development of the HMC space, were there any significant surprise or unexpected costs that you would recommend looking out for as another institution develops their own makerspace?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that you know, one of the things that I just mentioned, if I were starting this all over again, I would be thinking a lot more about trying to get my hands on some more storage space. And that sounds mundane, but being able to store student projects or faculty projects, especially large scale projects, is something that we're going to have a lot of call for, and we may not always be able to find the space in the makerspace to do that. So if I was designing it from scratch again, I'd be looking for some more space of that type. Beyond that, I think simply getting ahead of the makerspace development in terms of fundraising for the makerspace is really important. We had a good leg up on that with the foundation sort of transfer of a fund that I mentioned earlier, the Carol Mudd Sprague Endowment, that will support a significant part of our operating budget. but you know, get to the fundraising early because these places are not cheap.
Thank you. Do you think you will have any workshops for people possibly online or webcasts?
Also a great question. I think we may well do that. A lot of us have been learning from teaching online and taking courses online that while sometimes that can be frustrating, there are certain ways in which it works nicely for delivering certain kinds of information or certain kinds of training. So I would imagine especially that some of our training videos will be available for anybody who would want to watch them. So if you want to you know, watch our training video on welding and then go off and buy your own welder and learn to weld, you could certainly do that. So we may do some of that kind of thing. We may also look to the Hive, to the Sontag Center, as an exemplar in this way, because they have been doing some of that this year while they have been, you know, while students have not been on campus. So we'll look at where they had successes and see if we can build on that.
Very cool. Will users be able to mortgage space so they don't have to set up and tear down each time they use the space?
That is something that we will be working on, a policy we'll be working on with summer stewards to make sure that students have input into that idea. Clearly, that's going to be important for certain kinds of projects, and it works in different ways at different makerspaces. We may have certain projects that get some kind of special designation because they are difficult to put up and tear down. And so they may get to live for a while in a particular part of the makerspace. We'll see. But for many projects, we'll hope that they can simply be put away in storage until the students are able to come back and work on the projects. And we're going to have a lot of things like carts where students can store their work and move it easily from storage in and out to the main fabrication area. So, so I can't give you a perfect answer to that question. It is a really great question, and it's one that we're going to have to do some heavy thinking about this summer.
Great, thank you. So we are coming up on the hour, so we have one more question for you, Jeff. What is your first Makerspace project going to be?
My first Makerspace project, I want to learn to use a 3D printer because I have some things I want to make for my type shop. So I really am keen to get up and running on creating those nice three-dimensional objects in some kind of resin or something like that. So that will be a lot of fun for me.
That's awesome. That's super exciting. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. We look forward to seeing the Makerspace when we're able to. Thank you to our audience for your questions and for attending this event. We will follow up within the next week with a recorded video and presentation material. Up next on Mud Talks is Robots Crossing Boundaries with Professor Chris Clark on Wednesday, February 3rd at 4 p.m. Pacific time. An announcement for current parents, Family February registration is now open. Please visit hmc.edu/parents for the schedule of events and registration links. There will be a weekly digest sent to you every Monday of the events happening that week. All upcoming events can be found on our online offerings page using the link included in your confirmation email or by visiting alumni.hmc.edu and clicking on online offerings. We welcome any suggestions you may have for upcoming events, or if you are interested in hosting one, please email us at alumni@hmc.edu. Thanks again for joining us and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.